Okay, so the policy I would like to see changed and expanded is the renewal of the Violence Against Women Act. According to the Britannica, the act was put in place in of 1994 and was created to bring attention to domestic abuse, sexual assault, and stalking. But because the Trump administration's incompetence with the government shutdown in 2018, the act expired and nobody did anything about it. So without it, many government agencies, local nonprofit organizations, and university sexual assault prevention programs lose their funding. And according to the District Alliance for Safe Housing, the act enhanced sentencing for repeat federal sex offenders, mandated restitution to victims of specified federal sex offenses, and authorized grants to state, local, and even tribal law enforcement. The Violence Against Women Act is an imperative piece of legislation that thousands of survivors rely on to feel safe in America, and it's important that we hold the Biden administration accountable and push for its renewal. So the act was first created for the bill was the first act ever created for the sole purpose of protecting women, and it was a triumph for women's rights groups who spent years advocating for equal rights and safety. And according to the Women's Legal Defense and Education Fund, it included provisions on rape and battering that focused on prevention, funding for victim services, and evidentiary matters. So it kind of did a little bit of everything. It was a good balance. And it included the first federal criminal law against battery and a requirement that every state afford full faith and credit to orders of protection issued anywhere in the United States. So the Violence Against Women Act was initiated by then Delaware Senator Joe Biden, who is now president, and he sparked a long overdue conversation about domestic violence and the mistreating of women. And because of the act, services for women and victims of abuse have grown exponentially, as well as education and training services on how to handle situations of harassment or abuse. You see this a lot in college. We all had to take that course, and a lot of workplaces. So originally, the act was meant to improve criminal justice responses to domestic abuse cases, but it's going to cover things like not charging rape victims for forensic sexual assault testing, government-funded counseling services, and also criminalizing stalking by electronic surveillance, which is one of those things that wasn't really necessary back when the act was first created, but as time goes on and electronic things like grow and everybody's on iPhone, like that's a really important aspect of stalking. Another huge thing about the act is that it helps to target minority women and underserved communities, which are more likely to be victims of abuse than wealthy white women. And it specifically protects immigrant women and allows victims to cross state lines for custody orders, even if it's outside of their jurisdiction, which is a really important way to keep women safe if they're in an abusive domestic relationship. And just in general, the act is a balance of enforcement and criminal punishment. And then the other side of it is funding counseling and social services for victims after their trauma. So back to how it covers specifically women of color and minority groups. So women of color, specifically African-American women, have a 35% more chance of being abused than white women and 2 times more likely than other minority groups. And according to researchers, African-American women also experience much more violent cases of abuse compared to their white counterparts. And these statistics are with low reporting rates, so one can assume that the actual violence rates are much, much higher. And women of color typically experience higher rates of poverty, poor education, little job resources, and in some cases, the fear of deportation, which all makes them easier targets for abusers. They're all already in a position where they are looked over and ignored, and with the criminal justice system's proven bias against people of color, they rarely have a platform to speak out about their abuse. And another important aspect of this is that African-American women are disproportionately more likely to be criminalized by the justice system when they do seek help, which would lead to more women keeping quiet about their abuse, and which is why that a lot of statistics behind sexual assault, especially minority women, are not 100% accurate. So in addition to women of color, the LGBTQ plus community has been largely ignored when it comes to domestic violence and abuse. Almost 50% of lesbian women and 60% of bisexual women have been victims of abuse, stalking, or harassment. And in 2012, fewer than 5% of these victims sought to press charges or acquire orders of protection. And arguably the most targeted LGBTQ plus group is those who identify as trans women. I know you guys have probably heard in the news a lot. There's a lot of abuse towards trans women. And according to the Human Rights Campaign, in 2020 alone, we've only been in this year for like 2 months. At least 8 trans women have been killed by violent means. And in 2020, there were 44 fatalities making it the most violent year of targeted assaults of trans women since 2013. So some of these attacks were blatant hate crimes solely because they were trans. And in some cases, their identity put them at risk in other ways, such as their socioeconomic status, their inability to find a job, exclusion from certain communities, increased risk of mental health, of mental illness, and homelessness, or sex work for needs of survival. So the Violence Against Women Act has been reauthorized 3 times since its enactment in 1994, but expired again during the government shutdown of 2019 because the Trump administration decided it was just not important enough. And with Donald Trump out of the office, it's important to continue to push the Biden administration for the renewal of this act. Without it, women across the country are in more danger because of their abusers and because the government is no longer there to back them up. The Violence Against Women Act expiration was largely ignored by most government officials when it happened and was only really brought up by feminist groups and equal rights groups. And with Joe Biden being the person who first initiated the act, you'd think that it wouldn't take much to convince the administration to renew it. He started it and now he's the president. But his presidency is well underway and he hasn't mentioned it or brought it up really at all. And it's our duty as American citizens to advocate for the protection of women. But we have to keep in mind that while pushing for the renewal of the Violence Against Women Act, it's extremely important to ensure that it includes all women, such as women of color, minority groups, immigrants, and the LGBTQ+. With these women being far more likely to be domestically abused, harassed, or stalked, there's absolutely no reason that they should be excluded from the act. And the renewal should include explicit protection for trans women, a push to end racial bias when women are reporting their assaults, and immunity for victims who might be undocumented immigrants. No one should live in a violent situation because of the fear of being deported or criminalized because of something that is not their fault. In conclusion, the Violence Against Women Act is a necessary piece of legislation, and it's absolutely criminal that the Trump administration let it slip through the cracks and expire. Women across the country rely on this act to be safe to heal from the trauma of their abuse, and without it, they're essentially left out to dry by the government. The staggering assault and abuse rates in the country are evidence that there has to be some form of legislature that protects all women with no exceptions. Women are an integral part of society, and no woman deserves to be a victim or be left alone with no resources to fight back. Are there any questions?
I know at the university we all had to take like that sexual assault course like before coming in. So do you think there's anything else like the university can do to like offer support or more education in regards to that?
I know they did this before COVID. I'm not sure if they're doing it now because of the risk, but I know they offered like free support groups for victims of sexual assault on campus where like kids could come together and meet kids who had the experiences that they had. And I think that I'm pretty sure they ended it because of the pandemic, but I think that they should find a way to make that accessible again.
How would you rate the resources available for women at South Carolina?
Rate them. I think
like are they good? Do they have good resources or?
I think the school does a pretty good job. They have immunity for students in case something happened while they were drinking. They have people who work for the school that will go with any victims to the hospital to get tested, or will take them to the police so they don't have to be alone during it. And I think or they'll help with like moving your housing. Like if you want to be in a different dorm or whatever, they'll help with that. And I think that they do a really good job here making sure everybody is safe.
I was gonna wonder, like, how would we be able to make sure that Joe Biden like reenacts this?
There definitely needs to be more of a push within the government. Like I said before, everybody like within the government is very much ignoring it. It's really just outside feminist groups and individual people. So I think it would be really important to be able to communicate with our personal state representatives and get them within the government to push for it, because it's too important for just random feminist groups to be the only people talking about it.
Right. Thanks.
You mentioned that the act like contains a bunch of things within it and that it's like really well balanced with like counseling and preventative measures, things like that. What would you think would be the most important place to put the majority of like the funding for within the act?
So because women and minority and people in underserved communities are way more likely to be abused. I think that probably the majority of the funding should go to these underserved communities because someone from a wealthy, mostly white area, there's a much lower chance of it even happening to them. So I think it'd make more sense to put a lot of the funding into these minority communities.
Do you think that it should be like, how do I say it? The younger generation should have more awareness of it, if they implement it? Do you think it's important if they do it in middle schools or elementary schools and even high schools?
I
So,
think
like,
that, sorry,
have,
it was
like,
in.
have like a course like we have at here in South Carolina at the university, like have a course for high schoolers, middle schoolers, and elementary schoolers.
I think it'd be really important to start introducing it at a young age because there are a lot of kids who are victims of abuse and they don't even know it yet because they're so young. And the sooner that you bring it to their attention that like certain things are wrong and maybe you're not old enough to know it yet, is the sooner that there can be a stop to their abuse.
So when this expired, there was kind of a bit of outrage in higher ed that it was, that it was allowed to expire without really anything happening. And with Dr. Biden being the phrase that's kind of being used in higher ed, one of us, like she still teaches. So do you think maybe this could be something that we should encourage her to make part of her platform to push for? To kind of
100%. Yeah. Mm-hmm. She's a woman herself. I'm sure she's gone through times where she's been harassed. And as an educator, the bill expiring really affected universities. A lot of public universities rely on that government funding for these programs. And as an educator herself, she should care about it and she should urge the government to renew it.
I would like to see it part of her platform because I do think it is, something that she can relate to being, as I said, one of us. Like she's
exactly
in the education world.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
I think you're good to stop.
Thank you.